In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy would tour Willowbrook State School. Later in interviews, he would go on to refer to it as a snake pit, a place where children lived in filth, dressed in rags, and were treated worse than animals in a zoo. But what Kennedy saw that day was only the beginning. 7 years later, cameras would step inside, and the world would finally see the truth for itself. Children rocking in silence, bodies smeared in waste, and wards so overcrowded that one worker was left to control dozens of helpless kids. It looked like a scene from a nightmare, but this wasn't hidden in some far-off dictatorship. It was happening right in New York City. This was Willowbrook, a state-run school that promised families hope, but delivered one of the darkest scandals in American history. And once the doors were forced open, the horrors inside would change the nation forever. The story begins back in 1938 when plans were drawn up for a massive new institution on Staten Island in New York. Spread across more than 300 acres, the facility was designed to hold 4,000 children with intellectual disabilities. At the time, doctors and state officials insisted that families couldn't provide proper care at home. Institutionalization was sold as the modern, humane solution, a place where trained professionals would give children safety, therapy, and even education. Newspaper ads showed smiling nurses and happy residents, and politicians even spoke proudly of a new era in treatment. Parents who struggled to care for disabled children were told Willowbrook would give them the life that they deserved. But when the institution finally opened its doors in 1947, the reality was already breaking down. Budgets were tight, staff were stretched thin, and the population exploded far beyond what the building could hold. Within just a few years, 4,000 residents turned into 6,000, and by the mid-1960s, Willowbrook was the largest institution of its kind in the United States. Instead of education and therapy, Willowbrook became a warehouse, a place to hide society's most vulnerable, out of sight and out of mind. And soon, it would descend into conditions so degrading that even government officials were forced to speak out. Step inside Willowbrook on an ordinary day, and you wouldn't see lessons or classrooms. You'd see silence, broken only by screams. Children sat slumped on benches, rocking back and forth. Others wandered aimlessly, some unclothed, and some caked in dirt and waste. In one ward, more than 50 children were left to the care of a single exhausted attendant. That was one worker, feeding, dressing, and restraining dozens of children who couldn't even walk, speak, or feed themselves. Mealtime was frantic. Attendants shoveled food into mouths in minutes, trying to keep pace. Children who couldn't chew or swallow quickly enough choked. And in 1971 alone, at least 11 Willowbrook residents died this way. Not from illness, but from rushed feedings. Education was almost non-existent. Of Willowbrook's 6,000 residents, fewer than 1 in 5 ever attended a lesson. The rest were locked in wards for most of the day, stripped of stimulation, strapped into crib carts, or wooden boxes on wheels, where children were confined for hours. Disease was constant. Hundreds shared a single toilet, and hepatitis spread so fast that nearly every new arrival became infected within 6 months. Pneumonia, measles, and tuberculosis also tore through the population. Life at Willowbrook wasn't treatment, it was survival. Yet to outsiders, the institution kept its mask on. State officials released photos of smiling children in tidy wards. Parents clung to the illusion that their children were safe. Behind those walls, however, the very conditions that bred disease and despair would soon be exploited in the name of science. By the mid-1950s, Willowbrook was already a breeding ground for hepatitis. To doctors, that horror was not a crisis. It was an opportunity. Dr. Saul Krugman of New York University arrived at Willowbrook with a controversial plan. He argued that since children would contact hepatitis anyway, it was justifiable to infect them deliberately under controlled conditions to study how the disease spread. His goal was to separate hepatitis A from hepatitis B and test if immunity could be built. The methods were chilling. Some children were injected with blood drawn from infected patients, and others were given chocolate milk mixed with the stool of children who already had hepatitis. One by one, they fell ill, vomiting, turning yellow, and their livers inflamed. None of the children could consent. Parents were told that participation might give their child special care, or even move them into a cleaner ward. For many, it was less a choice than blackmail. Every deliberately exposed child became sick, and some were left with lasting damages. Krugman defended his work until his death, insisting that the studies advanced science. And indeed, they did help distinguish between hepatitis types, but the cost was carried entirely by Willowbrook's children. Bioethicists would later call these trials the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. And they weren't the only abuses. Neglect, overcrowding, and violence were daily realities. But in 1972, all of it would finally be dragged into the light. That year, young journalist Geraldo Rivera was handed a key by a former staffer. With his crew, he stepped inside Willowbrook unannounced. What he filmed would shatter the institution's carefully built facade. The footage showed children packed onto bare floors, rocking and wailing, the air thick with the smell of urine and infection. Wards crammed far beyond capacity. Rivera described it as hell on earth. Officials tried to stage manage a cleanup before his authorized return. Beds made, children dressed, staff attentive, but when Rivera came back unannounced, he found the same filth and neglect. The cover-up collapsed on camera. The broadcast, titled Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace, stunned America. For years, parents and advocates had begged for change. Now millions saw the evidence for themselves. Rivera went on to win a Peabody Award, but the real impact was public outrage. Parents of 5,000 residents launched a class action lawsuit against New York State. For the first time, the treatment of people with disabilities wasn't just a scandal, it was a civil rights battle. As former resident Bernard Carabello later said, privacy. At Willowbrook, there was no privacy. There was no dignity. The exposé made it impossible to look away. Willowbrook was no longer a school. It was exposed as a warehouse of human suffering. The lawsuit filed in 1972 as New York Ark versus Rockefeller dragged on for years. But in 1975, it produced a landmark ruling, the Willowbrook Consent Decree. The state was ordered to move residents into smaller community-based homes. Dignity, education, and medical care became legal rights, not privileges. The decree helped pave the way for broader protections, including the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act of 1980. But changes were slow. Willowbrook itself limped on. Staff shortages worsened, and neglect continued. It wasn't until 1987, 15 years after Rivera's exposé, that the last children were finally removed and the institution shut its doors for good. By then, the toll was staggering. An estimated 10,000 to 12,000 people had died inside, many from pneumonia, seizures, choking, or just simple neglect. Thousands more left scarred, physically and psychologically. Their stories never recorded, their names never remembered. Even decades later, the shadow remained. In 2020, the New York Times revealed ongoing abuse in group homes across New York. Homes meant to replace Willowbrook. Residents were still being beaten, neglected, and silenced. The system had changed its shape, but not its failures. Yet survivors also arose from the ruins. Bernard Carabello, institutionalized at age 3, spent 18 years inside Willowbrook, and when Rivera arrived, it was Bernard who opened the door and helped expose the truth. After his release, he became a leading disability rights advocate, founding the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State. In 2020, he received an honorary doctorate from the College of Staten Island, built on the very ground where Willowbrook once stood. His story is proof that resilience can grow even from systematic horror. Today, Willowbrook is remembered as one of America's darkest institutions, a warning of what happens when society hides away its most vulnerable. Its legacy is carved into laws, memorials, and survivors' voices that refuse to be silenced. Hello everyone. As always, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. If you happen to be new around here, welcome, and I hope you enjoyed as well. I try to post new videos every Friday around 6 p.m. EST. If you enjoyed today's topic or video, please like, comment, and maybe even consider subscribing. It really helps boost these videos, and it gets it out there and in front of more people. Any feedback or recommendations, leave them in the comments below and I'll get to them there. If you want to watch something similar, check out my video I did a while ago on China's dying rooms. That's all I have for this one. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.